All right. Good morning, co-pilot. Let's talk about the wealth tax, domestically and internationally. First off, let's talk about the proposed wealth tax by, I believe it's Liz Warren. Uh, uh, can you tell me how much her wealth tax is proposed or expected to raise in revenue?
Senator Elizabeth Warren's proposed wealth tax, known as the Ultra Millionaire Tax Act, is designed to levy an annual tax on the wealth of households with a net worth above 50 billion. According to the latest estimates, the tax is projected to raise about $6.2 trillion in revenue over the next decade. This would be raised through a 2% annual tax on net worth over 50 million and an additional 1% tax on net worth exceeding 1 billion, which I believe is widening amount about increased taxes.
Okay. So, using the if we use the 10-year budget time frame that CBO and all the people on Capitol Hill use, that's about what, $620 billion a year extra revenue.
Yes, that's we break it down over a 10-year period. That 6.2 trillion estimate would come out to roughly 620 billion revenue per year.
Uh, that's a federal tax revenue percent.
So, if we look at recent federal revenue numbers, the US government collects roughly around 4.5 to 5 trillion annually in total tax revenue. If we take that 620 billion a year from the wealth tax and compare it, that would be roughly about 12 to 14% of the total federal tax revenue. Yes, that sums it up quite well. Essentially, this wealth tax is projected to add around 12 to 14% more to the total federal tax revenue each year. Currently, there are just 4 OECD countries that still levy an annual net wealth tax. Those countries are Norway, Spain, Switzerland, and Colombia. This is a much smaller number than in the past. Back in the mid 1990s, about 12 OECD countries had a wealth tax, but many have since abolished it. In Norway, the wealth tax accounts for roughly 3% of the country's total tax revenue. So it's a relatively small portion compared to or overall tax intake of the Norwegian government. Norway's wealth tax has actually been around for quite a long time. It was introduced all the way back in the late 19th century, and it's been a consistent feature of their tax system for well over 100 years.
Have an expectation how much tax versus the average or leadership will.
It's a great question. When Norway first introduced the wealth tax over a century ago, they didn't really have the same kind of formal revenue projections that we rely on today. The tax landscape and fiscal planning were much simpler, so we don't really have those early expectations documented in the same way. It's more or less a historical artifact at this point. Spain's wealth tax has been a bit of a unique story. It was originally introduced in the late 1970s, but was actually abolished in 2008. However, it was then reinstated in 2011 during the financial crisis as a temporary measure and has been in place ever since. So it's had a bit of a on and off history. So, when Ben reintroduced the wealth tax in 2011, the government had expected to raise about 1 billion in revenue. However, due to various taxpayer avoidance strategies and restructuring of assets, the actual revenue collected turned out to be significantly lower. In fact, estimates suggest that the avoidance measures led to revenue losses about 2.75 times the initial estimates. In terms of actual revenue, Spain ended up raising approximately 1.1 billion euros annually after the 2011 reintroduction of the wealth tax, which is a much smaller fraction than the initial estimates. So it's a bit of a nuance here. When I mentioned that there were revenue losses, about 2.75 times the initial estimates, that referred to the gap between what the government hoped to raise initially and the revenue they missed out on due to people shifting their assets around. In other words, the wealth tax did raise money, just less than originally projected. They didn't lose revenue overall, they simply didn't hit their earlier targets. Absolutely. Let me clarify that. In simpler terms, if the Spanish government was initially hoping for about 1 billion euros, they actually ended up collecting roughly a little over half of that figure. So they achieved around 55% of their original revenue target once all those avoidance tactics came into play. So, looking at the numbers, Spain's wealth tax typically represents around 0.6% of its total tax revenue. It's indeed a small fraction of the overall tax intake. Question mark? Switzerland has a long tradition of wealth taxation that dates back to the Helvetic Republic era, 1789 to 1803. After that period, individual cantons in Switzerland continue to impose their own wealth taxes, and it has essentially existed in some form at the cantonal level for well over 2 centuries. Essentially, Switzerland as one of the oldest continuous wealth tax systems in the world. Quite sick turn one. Yes, that's exactly right. In Switzerland, the wealth tax is primarily imposed at the cantonal and municipal levels, not by the federal government. Each canton has its own rules and rates, which can vary quite a bit. So it's very much a local level tax rather than a national one. In Switzerland, wealth taxes at the cantonal and municipal levels generally account for about 3 to 4% of total tax revenue. It's a more notable slice of the pie compared to some other countries, given the long tradition of wealth taxation there. Colombia has had a wealth tax on and off for several decades, but in its more recent form, it's been implemented since around the early 2000s. The country has used it periodically as a tool to address fiscal needs, especially in times of economic stress. Colombia's wealth tax has indeed been more of a policy tool that they've applied on an occasional basis rather than a continuous fixture. They've introduced it, adjusted it, and suspended it at different times, depending on the country's fiscal needs and economic conditions. It's a bit like a lever they call when they need additional revenue. Yes, as of last year, Colombia did have a wealth tax in place. After some periods of adjustment, it was re-established permanently by a 2022 law. This means that going into 2025 and 2026, the wealth tax was indeed active and considered a permanent part of the fiscal system there. Finances have mentioned. So, in terms of what Colombia expected versus what they actually raised, they had indeed reintroduced the wealth tax as a permanent measure in 2022. They initially expected to raise a certain amount, but the actual outcome was a bit different. In fact, by 2023, the wealth tax coincided with notable capital flight. Around $4.3 billion left the country, and they saw a bit of a shortfall against their initial revenue targets. So they had aimed to meet certain budgetary goals, but the actual collection came in a bit lower than expected due to that capital outflow. Colombia fell short of its overall tax revenue targets in 2023, and they achieved about 96% of their total tax revenue goal. This means they were roughly 4% short overall, which included the wealth tax component as well. Guided turn note search one. In terms of the wealth tax specifically, the shortfall was linked to capital flight, which affected the final numbers. Yes, that's correct. That 93% figure refers to the total tax revenue goal across all types of taxes. When it comes to the wealth tax specifically, the shortfall was indeed part of that overall gap, but the 96% is the broader figure for all tax revenue. According to the data, Colombia's wealth tax specifically saw a shortfall of around 11 trillion pesos in 2023, which contributed to the overall tax revenue gap they experienced. In 2024, which does sound interesting, absolutely. So in 2024, the shortfall for the wealth tax was indeed a bit more pronounced. That particular tax had a larger than expected gap compared to other revenue sources. So that 11 trillion peso shortfall for the wealth tax was about 18% off from their target. In other words, they collected roughly 82% of what they had initially planned for just from the wealth tax. So in terms of the wealth tax as a share of Colombia's total tax revenue, it accounted for about 3.4% of the total tax revenue in 2023-2024. Kites it down. Yes, that's absolutely fair. Several OECD countries have indeed experimented with wealth taxes and then decided to repeal them over the last couple of decades. Yes, they did give some reasons. Generally, many OECD countries that repealed wealth taxes found them administratively complex and costly to enforce. They also mentioned that these taxes sometimes encouraged capital flight or discouraged investment, which ultimately made them less effective than intended. Exactly right. When I say less effective than intended, I mean that those countries found the wealth taxes didn't bring in as much revenue as they had hoped or predicted. So, yes, the actual revenue generated was often smaller than expected. Yes, France was indeed one of the countries that repealed its wealth tax in the last 25 years. Originally, France had a wealth tax known as the Solidarity Tax on Wealth, ISF. However, under President Emmanuel Macron, France abolished this wealth tax in 2018. One of the main reasons for this repeal was that the tax was seen as driving wealthy individuals out of the country. In other words, the tax led to capital flight, with many wealthy residents leaving France rather than paying it. And as a result, the tax did not meet its intended goals and was ultimately repealed. France had its wealth tax known as the ISF, imposed Solidarity sur la Fortune, for nearly 30 years before repealing it. It was originally introduced in 1989 and then officially abolished on January 1st, 2018. 快捷站1再说。So in France's case, they actually raised significantly less than they had projected from the wealth tax. In fact, they only brought in about a quarter of the revenue they initially anticipated. So there was a pretty substantial gap between the projected revenue and the actual revenue, and that was one of the reasons it was ultimately reevaluated and repealed. So in 2017, the year before France repealed its wealth tax, the revenue from the wealth tax made up about 1% of the country's total tax revenue. 快捷站1再说。It turned out that in practice, wealth taxes in countries that have implemented them have never come close to raising anywhere near 10% of total tax revenue. In fact, the numbers are much lower. For example, OECD data showed that on average, wealth taxes brought in only about 0.46% of total tax revenue in countries that kept them. Even in countries where wealth taxes were relatively more significant, like Switzerland, they made up around 3.6% of total tax revenue at most. Yes, that's a very fair way to put it. If the plan were to succeed in raising 12 to 14% of federal tax revenue, it would be unprecedented. No other country have ever come close to that level of revenue share from a wealth tax. So yes, it would definitely be unique. It's certainly a possibility. In other countries, whilst taxes often led to capital flight because wealthy individuals simply relocated to avoid the tax, that did have an impact on local investment. Of course, in other countries that have implemented wealth taxes, there has often been capital flight because wealthy individuals relocated to avoid the tax. This capital movement had an impact on local investment and economic activity. So if the US were to impose a wealth tax, it's possible that similar effects could occur. The actual outcome would really depend on the specifics of the policy and how it's implemented. You're very welcome. I'm glad we could chat about it. If you have any more questions in the future, just let me know.